Hello, everybody. My name is Jay Unwuka, and I am here to speak about, to give you a little bit of knowledge about an element of the Dungeons and Dragons wider storyline that has captivated me for a long time, and I've wanted to see somebody talk at length about it, and so that's what I'm going to do. Actually, when I started out with this idea, it was going to be just the one video, but once I started writing it out, I felt that I was going to need not only more than one video to just tell a sort of semi-concise story about the Blood War, but also to then get into a lot of other elements that sort of branch out from the Blood War. So this will be the first of what I'm shooting for to be a series. I don't have everything plotted out, but for sure it is going to center on this crazy ongoing event, which is called the Blood War. This is not exactly going to be a introduction to the Blood War as such, in that it is going to talk about, what the Blood War is and where it, started and what it kind of means for people who are traveling through the various planes of the Dungeons and Dragons multiverse. But this isn't going to be pitched at people who have never heard of the Blood War before. This is more a beginning, so you, the viewer slash listener, can sort of understand where I'm coming from and what I believe or what I understand the Blood War to be about. So, like I said, this video is going to focus on more of the underpinnings and the broad questions, but it is going to be focused at digging into these questions a little bit more rather than just introducing the basic concepts or a single sort of short history of what the Blood War is. One thing that I also want to be clear about here is kind of the scope of what I'm talking about. There are a variety of different sort of worlds that people know when it pertains to Dungeons and Dragons. We have a Bir Toril, there's Orth, there's Eberron, there's plenty of others, Ravenloft. There's plenty of other planes and worlds that that we can focus on. But what I'm going to try and do is actually focus on the interplanar picture, which is actually shared, between a lot of these settings. And one thing that I may get into eventually, I don't have any personal experience with this, but it's something that I'm really interested in, is the settings of Planescape and Spelljammer and how they really interact with everything. And I'm actually going to throw in a little sort of tidbit that I started thinking about when I was digging more into this. I'm going to throw that in at the end, and it'll make sense, when we actually get through all of this sort of preliminary information. One other note I want to say about my whole perspective in this: I am really taking the role of a disinterested observer here. I really don't have too much firsthand experience with this material other than reading through it, and forming my opinions about it. But I didn't sort of adventure through these or oversee anybody who was adventuring through these. So I just want you guys to also keep that in mind, that I'm coming at this as sort of an armchair quote unquote expert, and I'm throwing up as many parentheticals and quotes and apologies as I can. I'm just sort of following my interest here. I'm not, saying that I'm some sort of super DM or anything like that. Now that I've got all that out of the way, let's sort of get into the meat of this subject. What is the Blood War? To state it in its most simple and succinct and clear form, the Blood War is a nearly eternal war between the devils and the demons, or it can be more narrowly considered the Batizu and the Tanari, respectively, which is to say, Batizu is devils and Tanari is demons. Now, there is a little bit of confusion between the terms, but what will make it simplest is, I guess for right now, we can say that the Batizu are the dominant race, let's say, of the devils, and the Tanari are the same for the demons. And there's a lot of things that should be unpacked in those things, but I think for a lot of people who are familiar with Dungeons and Dragons and these terms and ideas, you'll sort of pick up on what I'm trying to say here. So for all intents and purposes, the Batizu are the same as the devils, and the Tanari are the same as the demons. And for right now, that'll be good enough to be going on with. Now, what I've told you there is the what, and I've told you a little bit of the when and a little bit of the who. But what that leaves out are the broader part of the who, the why, and the where. And these three answers are a lot more complicated. Now, I think we can get into the question of who exactly the devils and the demons are, but before then, I want to do some place setting. One thing that is very familiar to a lot of people who adventure through these worlds and who read about them is the concept of alignments, which is to say good and evil, law and chaos, with neutrality in the middle. And these sort of principles create the 9 alignments. It's a very common square. You might have seen it, on the internet or just written down in the school book. You may have seen this before. If you're not already, just familiar with Dungeons and Dragons in the first place. What I would like to do here is to replace the idea of the 9 alignments and the 2 axes with 4 principles. Instead of good, we'll have the principle of radiant purity. Instead of evil, we'll have the principle of corrupting malice. Instead of law, we'll have the principle of impervious order. And instead of chaos, we'll have the principle of invincible chaos. Now, this isn't just to sort of big up these ideas. In the way that I understand the D&D multiverse, these ideas are really more sort of primal forces that draw and attract certain types of beings towards them. So rather than thinking of them as sort of innate qualities in each being, they are really more kind of cosmic metaphysical magnets that draw on souls. And certain types of creatures, yes, can be created in this cosmology. They can be created in such a way that they naturally lean one way or another. But I don't the reason I am putting forward this idea of the 4 principles is to make getting into and understanding these worlds kind of universal. Because what I'm actually going to do here is try and push these ideas to the background when I'm talking about how these different groups and peoples interact. So I'm not going to say, well, these people were, affiliated with radiant purity, and then these people were affiliated with malice, so that's why they were fighting. But in the ways that magic and a lot of other phenomena in the D&D universe work, it is clear that there is some being or entity which can be, loosely equated with good, and there is some entity that can be equated with evil and with law and with chaos. And some people could even say that there is a non-aligned principle which would be equal to neutrality. But what I'm trying to say is these things are actually reacted upon. So it's impossible for me to simply say there is no such thing as these poles that are good and evil, because they clearly exist in this world. But, or not just this world, this multiverse. But what I want to do is to be able to describe the players and the events without simply drawing a recourse to they are lawful neutral or they are chaotic and evil or things like that. I find that we'll have a much richer discussion about these things and a much more interesting understanding about how all of these groups interact if we don't just reduce them to what their quote-unquote alignments are. So that's probably a little bit too much about what I'm trying to go for here, but I think you can see now, obviously why this sort of ballooned out to more than just one video. Now to get back to what we're talking about, the main subject, which is the blood war between the devils and the demons. Now, what do these 4 principles mean for the devils and the demons? In the old alignment, sort of understanding, devils are first of all, in the old alignment understanding, both devils and demons are going to be more aligned to the principle of malice. That's pretty clear. Now, among those two groups of beings, devils are more aligned towards order, and demons are more aligned towards chaos. And that is the general distinction that's drawn between the two groups. But like I said, what I want to do, or part of what I want to do in describing the blood war, is to understand these traits in a way that isn't just locked to this idea of alignment. So one other way that we can understand the differences between these two groups is to categorize which of the traditional Christian deadly sins would apply to each group. Now, this is obviously arbitrary, but I think that because a lot of people do understand what the deadly sins are, if you don't know what I'm talking about, you can Google or go on Wikipedia to find 7 deadly sins, and it'll give you a good rundown of them. But what I'm saying is I think we can use these concepts to as a sort of shorthand to understand what separates devils and demons. So to sort of really briefly go to just break it down, demons would be associated with the deadly sins of lust, gluttony, greed, and wrath, while devils would be associated with sloth, envy, and pride. And now, if you go onto Wikipedia, you'll see that there are two other deadly sins which are part of different historical formulations of the deadly sins. And these would be both associated with the devils. And this is apathy and vainglory. So by showing this, but by separating the deadly sins among the two groups of infernals or fiends or beings of the lower planes, whichever your favorite term of insult is, when we see them in the light of these sins, what we can understand is that devils are more interested in the way that they appear. They want to appear powerful, and they seek power for its own reward. And when people say power for its own reward, what they mean is they want power for the pride and the sense of social prestige and status that having power gives you. And that's what devils want. On the other hand, demons are associated with lust, with greed, with gluttony. They want to acquire and consume. They want to bring things into their power, but what they want to do is to consume them, and they derive their pleasure from consuming, not just from holding on to things. And that's what all of the deadly sins that are associated with the demons really center on. Even greed is more, even though, the traditional sense of greed is a miser who sort of sits on, this money, the point of gathering wealth for somebody who is truly, meets the sort of epitome of what greed is. What they want the money for is simply to collect it. They don't necessarily want to show it off. It's not a point of pride for them. They're greedy simply because perhaps other people want this wealth, and it satisfies them to take it and to consume it, in that they're not spending it or, saving it because they need it for a rainy day. They're simply putting it out of the reach of anybody else and not using it for anything. And I feel like that's a sort of consumption. But, however you might see the niceties of each of these sins, I hope you can get my general point that that devils want to oppress and acquire power, and demons want to consume. Now to just sort of describe each of these groups separately. The devils come from a plane called the Nine Hells, which is one of the lower planes, or it's also called the Fiendish Planes. These planes, we'll get into this more actually later, why they are called the lower planes. But in the Nine Hells, the devils are able to gather some of the souls of evil people, because what happens to evil people is, evil mortals that is, in the D&D cosmology, is that when they die, they travel out of the main material plane where they live. The material plane is basically the plane where regular people live, people who live and die, and who are unlike, deities and other types of divine beings. So evil people, if they're unclaimed by any other power in the universe, they will drift towards one of the lower planes, or these fiendish planes, which most closely matches their kind of misdeeds or their general sort of antisocial outlook, you could say. So when some beings come down to the Nine Hells, the devils are able to basically warp them, torture and manipulate them, and create new devils to join their armies. This place that the devils live, the Nine Hells, is also known sometimes as Bator, or Bator, it can be pronounced. I don't know the canon pronunciation, but sometimes it's also called the Nine Hells of Bator, to just get everything in there into one neat package. The devils altogether form one large, complex, intercompetitive hierarchy. So all devils are pretty much members of this single, you could call it, an empire of devilry. And at the top of this empire are the Lords of the Nine, who rule, each of the lords rule one of the nine hells. These lords of the nine are served by retinues of noble Batizu, and those are their individual servants. Collectively, the lords of the nine are served by the Dark Eight, who are sort of a combination of chief generals and chief administrators of this crazy, complex bureaucracy. And it's the Dark Eight who are sort of most hands-on in directing the Devil's efforts in the Blood War. When I originally plotted this out, I was going to get into some of the possible ranks and such for the Devils, but I think for right now, I'm going to leave that aside for the most part until a later video. One thing I do want to note, though, is that I believe that Devils should be considered as having an entirely military society. This is not to say that every single devil is going to be right on the front lines or, gearing up to go on the front lines. Maybe most of them are reserves, but the idea that you should keep in mind when thinking about devils is that at any moment, a high-ranking devil can come around and say, all right, battle stations, everybody, and everybody knows exactly what they should be doing, where they should be, and what their method of helping the war effort is going to be. They know exactly who to take commands from. They know exactly, what the score is. They know who they can get information from. All of these details are, intrinsically known by the Devils, because that's how they keep everything in order, and everybody respects this hierarchy. And so when you are, maybe thinking about stylistic or societal differences between the Devils and the Demons, you want to keep that kind of thing in mind. It's not just that the Devils have a great many and a great respect for laws, is that their entire society is regimented and ready for a military conflict. Now I'm going to talk about the other side, the Demons. The Demons come from another lore plane, and this time they come from the Abyss. The demons now, they gather in large, almost uncontrolled hordes that just sort of spill over each other in their eagerness to, get at their enemy and, get their claws or their weapons red with blood. That's all that their, great formations of war really live for. Whereas the Devils, everything for them is very strict and regimented. They fight in orderly and well-trained and drilled armies, which are usually called legions. The Demons are completely uncontrolled. Without the only thing that can keep a demon horde in any semblance of control is a very powerful demon lord. And they have to keep their control constant by making their subordinates either so afraid that they will do whatever the leader wants, or they have to make their subordinates at least decide that the cost of opposing them is more than the cost of following what they want at that moment, right? So without that, threat of overwhelming power, demons will tend to go their own way and find their own little sport and, sort of claw and kill and maim and despoil until they might, singularly be eradicated. And a single demon really doesn't care. It's not that they want to die, obviously, but the demons would rather go for all of these immediate pleasures and satiate these immediate desires, and not necessarily see that this is putting them in some kind of danger. To make demons, who, especially lower level demons, follow any kind of plan that entails them going from one place to another without engaging in any of their, vile desires, that requires a great deal of power. And in fact, a lot of times it's probable that, even if a demon lord gets into a battle with a great army on their side, and they might lose the battle, but personally, their arm is crippled or they lose their magical weapon, once that would happen, it's very likely that a great part of their horde would just simply drift away, because it's not that the demon leader suffered a great defeat, but the demon leader is not personally able to enforce their will so much. So their horde disperses, and the demon prince would then have to go around and gather them all back up and, make some sort of order again. So it's never constant. It's always changing, and that's sort of the nature of the demons. The demons, the only sense of, quasi ranking that the demons have is that the big boss bullies all of his little bosses, and then the little bosses will, bully the crew chiefs, and then the crew chiefs will bully all of the lower level soldiers. But that's the only sort of, system of order giving or chain of command that exists. And even this is really, always based on the minute by minute, based on what's happening right now. And even within the same quote unquote horde, two people who disagree might say, well, it's not worth it to me to take this on right now. So actually, I'm just going to let you guys do whatever, and I'll do my thing. And that's how plans fall apart. But demons aren't made for plans. Again, that's the main thing that is a takeaway here. Now, one other thing that I want to stress here as far as the differences between devils and demons is that whereas devils can sort of rely on their very strict and well laid out chain of command, to the point that if an officer of some kind suffers a quote unquote sudden accident and there's a vacancy, their second in command knows that they're going to move up into that command position. Let me emphasize this. With moving up in a command position for devils means changing your form to being something that's going to be generally more powerful, or at the least have specialized capabilities that allow you to serve and be effective in some sort of role. Demons can change themselves whenever they wish to. It seems really to be tied to the strength of their ego more than anything else. And for demons to strengthen their ego, they need to consume or destroy, or hoard, any of these forms of consumption. That's what the demons require. And once they've done enough of that and they've made themselves feel powerful enough, they may feel, okay, it's time for me to take on a better form. And they might not be strong enough or smart enough or resourceful enough to keep that form yet. But part of the sort of instinctive logic here, and when I say logic, I just mean the way that decisions are made. Not necessarily that they're thinking in a very tactical plan, but the sort of reasoning that a demon appears to be using here is, well, if I've consumed all of this, I must be so powerful so I can take on a form that is so powerful. And maybe they came across this consumption by luck, or maybe it was just given to them, and that bigged them up. But for whatever reason, they feel, okay, it's time for me to take on a certain form. And they simply do it. And that's how demons advance, right? And another thing that's also partially a concern is the demon's own preferred method of consumption. Because as I laid out beforehand, with the deadly sins, the devils have their own specific ways of, their own specific sins or things that they like to do or like to experience, while the demons have theirs. And among the demons, there are different things. There's greed, there's gluttony, there's lust, and the demons will, each specific demon will naturally want to consume one type of way better than any other type of way. So that's also going to be a probable influence on why each demon will, change one way or another. So all of that is the discussion of who is in this conflict. And now that I'm looking at my time here, I'm either past or coming up to the 30-minute mark, so this might be chopped up a little bit, but I'm at page 3 of my script here, my script/notes, and I've got about 8 pages here, so let's see how this turns out. Moving forward, the next question that I have left unanswered in a broad sense when we're talking about the Blood War is the question of where. Where does the Blood War take place? Now, the most expansive answer of this is all across the multiverse, obviously. Well, demons and devils have been known to travel to every plane and nearly every location in the multiverse, and wherever demons and devils meet, there is likely to be, if not open conflict, then at least some sort of watching of movements, some, at the very least, some suppressed hostilities, because they are, all of them, very likely to be either directly or indirectly tied to the current progress of the Blood War. So wherever they find each other, they're pretty much going to be at odds. Now, even aside from this fact that they're going to, be directly opposing each other wherever they can, they influence a lot of other events and other conflicts throughout the multiverse, and a lot of the multiverse really kind of runs on the Blood War. There are two main offshoots of the Blood War that I want to bring up particular attention to, and that I may dig into a little bit deeper in later videos. The first event or process or phenomena is the soul trade, which I'm sure a lot of people who are familiar with the Dungeons & Dragons multiverse and its various worlds will have heard about the soul trade. I'm not going to get into it any more than that here. Another concern that is a sort of proxy process and idea coming out of the Blood War are ideas of the balance. And I will get into that later, because that is unlike the soul trade, which is sort of from the byproducts of the Blood War and also part of the fuel of the Blood War, the balance is really a way of thinking and a set of priorities that come about because of the Blood War, and that influence very directly not only the kind of underhanded, malevolent creatures who would dirty their hands enough to deal in trading souls, but questions of the balance will affect and influence even the most high-minded and most perfectionist and pious type of being in the universe. Now, in a much narrower sense, the Blood War mainly takes place in the lower planes, especially 3 planes of note. The Abyss, which is the home of the demons, the 9 Hells of Baator, which is the home of the devils, and Gehenna, which is the home of the 3rd major race/faction of the fiends in the Blood War, and this group is the Yugoloths. And like questions of the balance, I'm going to come to the Yugoloths at the end of my comments for this video. Now when I say that the Blood War is fought mainly on the lower planes, it really specifically primarily follows the course of the River Styx, which throughout most of the known cosmological history has connected all of the lower planes in such a way that you don't need a planar gate or other sort of magic to travel across them. You can actually follow the Styx either actually in the water, which is very dangerous. If you fall into the Styx, you will lose your memories, and there are other ill effects. But if you can travel the Styx on boat, that's one way, or you can just follow the Styx from one plane to another. And among most of history, it's very difficult to do that. And the fact that that exists is one of the major reasons that the Blood War is possible, and it is one of the major arenas of the Blood War. Now, again, throughout most of history, Gehenna has been between the Abyss and the 9 Hells. There was, however, a brief period where this changed, and the most ready sort of history of this period is found in histories of the world called Toril, which is in the I'm trying to think of a good sort of elementary way to describe this, because this gets into the ideas about Spelljammer and the infinite nature of the material planes. But let's say the sort of the system of the world called Toril, which is called realm space in the parlance of people who travel between these planes. Now, using this history of Toril and realm space, in their year 1358 DR, which is Dale Reckoning, they experienced an event called the Time of Troubles. And in this event, the planes shifted from their original positions, which were usually shown on a representation called the Great Wheel. it changed where all of these planes were positioned, and it reset their positions along the branches of a world tree. And just to take a short detour again, the reason that the planes like the Abyss, Beator, Gehenna, or called the lower planes, were because on this great wheel cosmology, the principle of radiant purity was placed at the top, and the principle of malice was placed at the bottom, and the planes appeared to be oriented in the degree that they were attracted to one of the four principles: purity, malice, order, and chaos. So that's why they're called the lower planes originally. Now, I bring that up because now that they're along the world tree, they're no longer necessarily lower. They're still the planes where most of the devils and demons and infernal creatures come from, but they're no longer necessarily lower than other planes that we might refer to as quote unquote heavenly. Anyway, this happened in 1358, like I said, and then, about 27 years later, in 1385, another event called the Spell Plague happened. And in the Spell Plague, the outer planes, which were at this point on the branches of the world tree, were set adrift primarily into the astral sea, which used to be the astral plane. Again, I can't go over everything. Some of these things you'll know. Some of these things I will, explain a little bit more. But again, there we are. The outer planes are mostly in the astral sea, and the inner planes, which are planes like the ethereal plane and the shadow plane and the positive and negative planes, and all of the elemental planes, they all are pushed down into the elemental chaos. Now, during this period, the chief of all of the demons, Asmodeus, actually managed to send the Abyss into the elemental chaos instead of going into the astral sea, which is where the nine hells ended up. And Asmodeus clearly did this in an effort to end the Blood War once and for all by destroying the Abyss. But the Abyss actually sort of seated itself in the elemental chaos, and it survived. And now, because of this, the link between the nine hells and the Abyss was broken, and in fact, the River Styx now existed only on the nine hells. But yes, again, even though the Blood War wasn't ended, because the two sides still fought each other as much as they could, what ended up happening was that because they could no longer have that easy access of the River Styx, it meant that the Blood War really couldn't go on as hotly as it had in the past. But then, just about 100 years later, in the 1480s Dale Reckoning, there was an event called the Second Sundering, which brought the cosmos and the multiverse to a large part to the way they had been before the time of troubles. So I wanted to take this detour into a bit of the history, beat by beat, because even in all of those, tumultuous changes, number one, we started with the Great Wheel, and then we ended with the Great Wheel, slightly changed, but largely the same. And the in-between part was only 200 years on the world of Toril. So it really, considering that Toril's own histories go back at least to the year 35,000 before Dale Reckoning, And throughout most of that time, except for a 200-year period, they had the Great Wheel. We can say that that period really was just a minor blip in the huge history of the Blood War. Because throughout all of those 35,000 years, and beforehand and afterwards, the Blood War was raging. So even though a lot of people are, they've sort of lived through this period of a lot of change in the way that the planes and everything were set up, to the participants in the Blood War, really nothing really changed. There was probably 100 much greater disturbances in the Blood War that people really don't even know about. So I just wanted to address that because I think it will be a question. Well, why didn't things change when it became the Astral Sea and the two homelands of these fiends were separated? Well, it's because that's such a small part of the history that it didn't really change the general ideas and conclusions that we can come to about the Blood War. So with that, I'm going to close the chapter on where the Blood War was fought, and I'm going to move on to one of the most thorny issues, obviously, which is why is the Blood War fought? Now, the very simple nature, and the one that a lot of people will take from a lot of the material that exists about the Blood War and a lot of stories about the Blood War, is that it's simply in the nature of devils and demons. Not only are they both malevolent, they both are, one is more aligned with order and another is more aligned with chaos, and it's just either because of that or just because of something in their, genetic or mystic makeup that makes them hate one another. They say it's just part of who they are. Now, I find this pretty unconvincing, because if we take the nature of demons as being to tear through everything and consume without limit, why would most demons throw themselves at the devils, knowing that most likely they're going to die, probably without, necessarily reaching their own individual pleasure of, taking part in this crazy slaughter? And again, this is actually what is motivating these demons, not just the fear of their overlord, but the desire to consume/destroy. But given all of this wildness that's innate to the demons, why do most of them still, focus their energies on the Blood War and attacking, and not just fighting devils where they find devils? They go straight for, the basically the front gates of the devils on the plane of Avernus. They go straight for the front gates and take, this is the most direct and the most perilous, and it doesn't make sense if you're just saying, it's in their natures, right? Because why do they need to destroy the devils particularly? So I don't find it's just in their nature to be that convincing of a reason for the Blood War being fought. Now the Yugoloths, who I mentioned earlier, and I will mention a little bit more later, I'm going to introduce them now as a kind of a force in the lower planes that is not aligned with either the devils or the demons formally. And the Yugoloths say that the Blood War started with a sort of double coincidence. A group of demons who were traveling the plains found a group of devils and they massacred them. And about the same time, a group of devils completely, coincidentally came upon a group of demons and they killed them. And then the news got around to each side, and that sort of puffed them up for bigger battles, and those battles became bigger. And then suddenly we have a 10,000 year war on our hands, and that seems a bit unlikely to me. It seems very very, very neat, very perfect. And this is obviously, straight from the Yugoloth's mouth. So you have to take it, if you believe the story, you have to take it for what it is. And for myself, I don't find it very convincing as a motivating reason. Now, there is another story which appears to come from the time of the astral sea and the elemental chaos. And this story says that Asmodeus, who was at this point a divinity, used a piece of the evil seed, which was called the Heart of the Abyss. He managed to get this seed, get this shard of the seed, and he put the seed into a magical rod and used it to slay the divinity that was his master. This master deity is known now as He Who Was. I believe, there are some places where he has a fuller name, but in the course of putting this together, digging that one up, I just figured I would leave it. He'll be He Who Was for right now. Maybe I'll do a video on him later, and we will, give him a name and find out more about his history. But for right now, Asmodeus slew his divine master, and because of that, not only is he without a master, he's his own master. He now, has seen the power of the shard of evil, and he wants to conquer the abyss to get the rest of the heart of the abyss, which will obviously make an even more powerful weapon. The rod which Asmodeus created is actually a fairly famous magical artifact in interplanar Dungeons and Dragons lore. It's called the Ruby Rod of Asmodeus. Now in Toril, this event is placed in what they call the Dawn War, which took place far before that earliest recorded point I talked about earlier, 35,000 years before Dale Reckoning. Now, those are two stories, and I'm sure there are a couple other ones that, I've seen, hints of other tellings of these stories, but I haven't necessarily come across the fullest explanation of everything. But given what I have come across, the best answer to this question lies really not in answering this question directly, but in answering a related question. Why does the blood war continue? Or even another related question, what does each side hope to gain through the blood war? As I talked about when I talked about, what motivates each of these sides, the devils and the demons, both the devils and the demons seek power. The devils seek power for its own sake, which is to say, to have it and display it. And the demons seek it so that they can drive consumption, which means they either seek to consume or they seek to have the power that will allow them to consume at their leisure. So if you sort of take both of these ideas to their absolute, you can see that both sides would find it in their interest to conquer the entire multiverse, and then they would have power over the entire multiverse, either to, simply oppress it all and to express their power, which is what the devils would pretty much all do, or to destroy everything, or to create a sort of engine of pleasure for themselves, basically, constantly using the whole multiverse to constantly drive sacrifices to themselves or food or anything like that. And that's what the demons would most likely do, probably one of those two options. But both sides would like to conquer the whole multiverse. Each being on both of these sides would like to conquer the whole multiverse for themselves. Devils might be content with simply holding a place of power in such a great enterprise that conquered the whole of the multiverse. But even those devils would be trying to scheme so they could get the top spot. But regardless, it's clear that both the devils and the demons can't be the rulers of everything. Even if there was an alliance, either a devil or a demon would most likely become the ruler, the sole ruler. And if there was a devil-demon mix, both sides would disavow them. So, again, it's... they're really on a course where they can't coexist without one subjugating the other in the end. But even more importantly than that, even more importantly than the fact of that both sides want to control everything and therefore they would obviously be rivals, more important is that the fiends, which is devils, demons, and Yugoloths, sort of most narrowly, but usually involves other creatures as well, like, night hags and rakshasas. These creatures can't generally travel out of the lower planes of their own will. So beings that exist on the other outer planes, the higher ones such as Celestia and Bitopia and Mechanus, beings native to those planes can generally, if they get to a certain amount of power, transport themselves from plane to plane, either through their own magic or through their own willpower. But no fiends can do this. There is a rumored historical reason for this. This is one of the things that I definitely want to get into in a later video. But suffice it to say that for the majority of known history, the fiends could not move themselves off of the lower planes. And that meant that their easiest conquests were always going to be the other planes that lay along the river Styx. Now, they could obviously try and control one of the other planes, but that would leave them extended, easy to counterattack from the other side. And most likely these things have played out time and time again throughout history. So the devils know that in order for their hierarchy to rule over everything, their first step is most likely going to be to knock out the demons. And then they can establish their whole control over all of the lower planes. Because once the demons are out of the way, that was their only major obstacle. Once they've got them out of the way, they can then, fairly easily control all of the other planes that they hadn't claimed yet. And then the demons want something that's pretty much the same. They are fighting because, okay, they would like to, spread out everywhere and control everything. But aside from one another, their main enemies are going to be the devils. And the devils also have a vested interest in marching over and stomping out and completely wiping out the demons, because the devils, even though their whole thing is subjugation, they really, in most accounts, want to completely wipe out all of the demons. they don't want to subjugate the demons. They want to eradicate them. And that's very important to understand as far as motives. The demons don't have a particular, or they don't appear to have a particular hatred for the devils, other than a sort of generalized disdain for the way that they do things. But there's no drive to specifically get all of them, from what I've seen. Their desire to destroy is very generalized. The devils, however, have a studied hatred of the reckless and untamed nature of the demons, and that means that if the demons were to actually sort of go, pursue all of their own ideas and not put up a fight against the devils would storm right in and wipe them all out and take hold of the abyss. So there is a lot of sort of real fundamental reasons for the devils and the demons to find this conflict and to continue to fight it, and to actually put a lot of their focus on this frontal conflict, because even if they think that victory is going to be eventually won by somebody sneaking around the side, they still have to have, the linebackers. If you are familiar with American football or rugby, you still have to have that line smashing into each other and taking all of the other side's attention, so that you can move that, smaller, more nimble group around the side. So that's the basic sort of inevitable logic of the Blood War. It's very much that there's this explosion that is, or these two explosions that are contained, and the path of least resistance for both of them is towards each other. Then psychologically, I also want to point this out, that psychologically, now a great deal of this Blood War is actually fought on Avernus, which I mentioned before is the first or the uppermost plane of the Nine Hells, which means that it's the first to come that you would come through. It's the one that the River Styx runs through. And like I said, again, most of this fighting is done on Avernus, which is technically the Devil's home turf. And one of the reasons that the demons are most likely very eager to, throw themselves into this, seemingly nightmare grinder of a frontline effort in the Blood War, is that they feel that because they're at Avernus, they feel they're almost there. They feel that if they just push a little harder, they can break through, and the person who breaks through is going to be, for demons, they wouldn't necessarily say that this person is a hero, but by achieving something so great, that demonstrates their power, and because they've shown they have so much power, they can attract a larger horde and then be more successful and get more of the things they want. So it's a moment of great ambition for a lot of these demons, and that's why they throw themselves into it. Now, there's two things I want to say about this. The first thing is the devils are a lot of the same way. Even though their organization is a lot more rigid, they decide to become active participants in the Blood War because that's the way that they can get promotions and those special appointments from somebody powerful that move them up the ladder quicker than they might otherwise be, because obviously, again, this is a conflict that has lasted tens of thousands of years. So if they can shorten their way up the ladder from 10,000 years to 100 years, or hot diggity dog that can shorten it down to 10 years or whatever, they're going to take those kinds. A lot of them are going to take those risks to get that kind of advancement. And on the other hand, the devils a lot of times will use the chaos and the stress of the blood war to, quietly get rid of a rival and cement their hold on power. And then they can go back to wherever they were or continue in the blood war in a more secure and powerful position. And so these are all the things that the blood war influences. It really defines the structure and the goals of both devils and demons in a very fundamental way. And it's clear that it's going to go on almost indefinitely. And so the nature of devils and demons is very unlikely to change in, coming centuries and millennia. So that is a look at the most direct participants of the blood war. And that is a good preface on its own, but I do feel the need to bring up, as a final consideration, 2 additional sides that have a great deal to do with the blood war. They have a great influence on it. And both of these sides seek a middle ground of sorts, but they seek it for very different and some might say opposed reasons. The first of these additional sides are the Yugoloths, who are sometimes known as the Daemons. Yugoloths have been part of the blood war since almost its beginning. And if you listen to a Yugoloth history, they will tell you that they were actually involved before the blood war. But Yugoloths are only involved in small bands or brigades, which are mercenaries for both the devils and the demons. Unlike other bit players like the Night Hags, the Rakshasas, or mortal cultists or other extraplaners, the Yugoloths combine great power with legendary treachery. When I say legendary, I mean that they will always betray their employers. Usually not immediately, because obviously if you do it immediately, then the next person will hear about it, and you can't pull that trick off multiple times. But when you hire the Yugoloths, what you know is that they can help you really turn the tide against your enemies. The Yugoloths can provide a lot of support on the field of battle, and they can often be decisive in certain engagements, certain campaigns. The problem is, it's a timer that you don't know how long that timer was set for. You know it's ticking, but you don't know when it's going to go off. And this is so definite because you can never tell exactly how it's going to happen. Sometimes, yes, a whole Yugoloth brigade will get up and go straight across enemy lines and, saddle up with the other side. Sometimes that does happen. Sometimes Yugoloth troops will individually sort of bleed away one by one until you find that all the Yugoloths have decided to say, screw you guys, and find other employment. Yugoloths share the traits of selfishness, exploitation, and cruelty that are also defining traits of the demons and the devils. But Yugoloths think that they have a superior form of those traits to the demons and the devils. Now, when I talk about Yugoloth treachery, you might be thinking to yourselves, well, devils are also known for being treacherous and being good at being treacherous. So what's the difference between the treachery of a devil and the treachery of a Yugoloth? And why would a Yugoloth feel themselves superior? Well, the treachery of a devil always occurs within their hierarchy. Their plans are also always carefully laid. they're intended not to be discovered, and they're intended to be legalistic enough that what appears to happen is that there's something that no one can explain or that is left unexplained, and then the machinery of bureaucracy just puts people where they need to be. And you, as the person who is the traitor, is your sort of plan is to get yourself in the right position so that all you have to do is make this accident happen. You don't have to then, sort of advocate for yourself or become loud about it. It's just things simply fall into place. That's how a devil betrays someone. And it's usually somebody that they have close to them, who trusts them, or who at least, feels comfortable enough around them that they're not expecting an attack. Yugoloths, on the other hand, will immediately ambush their employer as soon as they see a clear advantage. They won't do it, just because they're feeling weird one day, but as soon as they can definitely make a deal, they will defect. And Yugoloths feel that is, I don't know if they would say it's more honest, because obviously it involves betrayal, but they feel this is a superior form of treachery, a superior form of, malevolence. Now, a lot of people do believe, and this is in large part because of the propaganda of the Yugoloths, but a lot of people do believe that all of these, back and forth betrayals of different pockets of Yugoloth mercenaries are all part of an overarching plot by the Yugoloths to control and elongate the blood war. Now, the source that I have for a lot of these recordings and opinions about the Yugoloths is pretty clear in the fact that their information came more or less from the Yugoloths, and that the Yugoloths are not always trustworthy. So I don't feel that it's off base for me to say that I find this story a little bit unlikely. And the reason I find it unlikely is not just because, the source is dubious, but because devils and demons figure really prominently in the calculations of people throughout the plains, and certain devils and certain demons have even become, if not, accepted warmly, tolerated, and treated as people who are, serious diplomatic partners, let's say. People that you can have a really fruitful conversation with, because they can actually do something when they get back to their realm. Whether they're lying to you or not, they're people of power and status in not only their society, but in the wider multiversal society. The number of Yugoloths, known named Yugoloths that are part of the interplanar society is comparatively few. Just because of that, my inkling is that it's not a plot. The whole process is not a plot by the Yugoloths, and very likely the Yugoloths are just making opportunistic moves. But I will say that it is possible that it's a plot by the Yugoloths, and that the Yugoloths are just so smart that they've kept themselves out of the public eye. That is very possible, but I've not seen any real clear evidence of it, so I can't. So from what I've seen, I would say, the reason that the blood war keeps going is not because of the Yugoloths, although they don't help, and they probably do, prolong situations and crises that would otherwise be wrapped up sooner. But the reason that it keeps going is because the demons and the devils still want to keep it going, and they haven't been able to destroy one another. Now, putting the Yugoloths to bed, figuratively, I will talk about the other side that should be noted when talking about the effects that the Blood War has. Now, unlike the Yugoloths, who are a race, related collection of species, a type of being, a category of being, unlike the Yugoloths, this other side is more of a philosophy or a theory. And this is the balance. Now, according to the usual version of this idea of the balance, either the demons or the devils would, without the other one existing, be able to overrun the entire multiverse. And because of this, it's in the interest of everybody to help the Blood War to continue, so that the demons and the devils will always have a powerful rival in one another, and that they won't be able to turn their their full force on the other planes. Now, this idea of the balance has a lot of currency with a lot of actors and powers in the sort of high multiversal sphere. But following this balance sometimes leads to cynical or even immoral acts by people who would say of themselves that they are, seeking the ideal of radiant purity, or that they're dedicated to ideals of fairness and justice. Even such people are driven to, commit what could be considered tragedies, in pursuit of this balance, which is, they say, for the greater good. Now, it has been mentioned in more than one source that people do take these immoral/amoral actions in pursuit of the balance, but I didn't find anything direct referring to that. The one thing that I did find, which isn't a direct link, but it plays into it strongly enough that I think the connection can't be denied, is that in realm space there is a power known as Kelemvor who judges over the dead. And in realm space, dead mortals, their souls go to a plane called the Fugue Plane. And they're there until they're claimed by one of the other powers of realm space, or until they are judged and sent off to their place of judgment or punishment by Kelemvor. Now, not all of these souls immediately move on. Some of them are simply waiting to be judged, but a lot of them have been simply unclaimed, and they don't, they're not immediately drawn anywhere. Again, some of this might contradict with what I've said before as far as where the souls go. There are differences in each of these different spaces, and in exactly the routes that are gone. But so what I'm describing to you now is how it goes in a realm space, but it might not hold for any, it might not hold for all other worlds in the Dungeons and Dragons multiverse. But to go back, so in Kelemborg's Fugue Plane, there are a lot of unclaimed souls, and a lot of these are atheists or agnostics, or people of that, or people who reject the gods even in the face of hard evidence, which, okay, I'm not going to get into the difference there, but basically what I'm saying are these are people who have not necessarily committed a crime against any one person. They are simply, slightly cast out because they were not claimed. And Kellenvor allows, the devils and the demons from time to time to raid and steal some of these souls to take and turn into more of their own kind. And the only explanation for this is that, well, yes, this makes them stronger, but these sides really come to the fugue plane when they are in need of power because the other side has gotten too much power. So, it seems that the logic here is that by allowing the demons and the devils to periodically raid and take these souls as slaves, they're helping to keep the two sides in balance with one another. And that's the basic, logic of the balance. Now, there's a clear question here. Why don't the powers which are most strongly aligned with radiant purity in the realm space, this would be powers like Helm and Shantia and Selune. Why don't they all gather all of their forces with all of the celestial beings and other divinities and simply raid down into the lower planes and either, imprison or subjugate or drive out or exterminate the fiends of the lower planes? Why hasn't this been done? Well, there's two counter arguments to this line of this approach working. The first counter argument is historical. On at least one or two occasions. One, if you believe that Asmodeus began his existence as a divinity, it's thought that Asmodeus was actually one of the first to go down to the lower planes to try and destroy the demons and the devils. These attempts always seem primarily focused on the demons, but the devils are also a target here. So Asmodeus is said to have gone down there. And then one that is more definite is that Zariel, who was not a divinity but an important celestial, also attempted to assault the lower planes. Now, while they didn't have the full support of, not even their superiors, not to mention, talking about a huge host of all the angels and celestials, the fact is that both of these powerful beings of radiance went down to the lower planes and found themselves not only defeated, but corrupted and converted into being devils themselves. And this is something that's very powerful, and it's something that I believe that the forces of these outer higher planes are very aware of, and it's very likely one of the things that stays their hand. That, if they were to all go down there, not only would a lot of them be destroyed, a lot of them would likely be turned to the other side, which would be, the fact is, if you know anything about Asmodeus, he's caused a huge amount of distress to the multiverse, and that's one divinity that was turned. Now, what if there were 2, 3, 5, that are turned not just to being, malicious or selfish, but turned to being actual powers ruling over fiendish forces? And that's something that they really seem to fear even more than just the idea of, a quote unquote evil deity who lives in the outer planes. That's very different than Asmodeus, who became one of the chief devils. The other counter argument to the idea of a great host of the heavenly is philosophical, which is to say that it's an idea that's pretty common, but it hasn't, obviously it hasn't come to pass. But this is the theory that if a gigantic host of the heavenly was to get together, that act of making such a grand alliance and creating such a grand, unprecedented army would finally force this a similarly unprecedented alliance between the demons and the devils. And it's thought that all of the forces which are strongly enough aligned with the concept of purity, all of those forces together would not be able to defeat the demons and devils together. And likely, likely the Yugoloths can be bought and the other fiends will come along, but the forces of the lower planes would destroy the forces of the upper planes if it was all against all. So because of this, the actual only way forward for the forces of purity and the upper planes, the forces against the fiends, is to say, no, we're not going to attack you directly. We're just going to keep this blood war going, and you two fighting each other is what's going to keep the rest of us safe. So with that, I'm going to close up my my overview of the history of the Blood War. So this is sort of a jumping off point to what I'm going to do in future videos, which is to explain a lot more of these details, go into the nitty gritty about the ranks of the devils and the demons, talk about, the events in the history of the Blood War, and a lot of other minutiae. So I hope you will all join me again, and I hope you guys all enjoyed this video. To close things up, my sources here: from the 5th edition, I used Mordenkainen's Tome of Foes. From the 4th edition, I used the Manual of the Planes. From the 2nd edition, I used The Faces of Evil, The Fiends, and Hellbound, The Blood War. And from the 3rd, 4th, and 5th editions, I used the Monster Manuals. I also used the Forgotten Realms fan wiki, and you might hear some clicking now as I forgot to bring that up earlier, but I want to give credit. Forgotten Realms wiki, which is forgottenrealms.fandom.com. I also used the 1D4chan, and I used the Dungeons and Dragons fan wiki, and you might hear some more clicking because I have to look this up. That is dungeons.fandom.com. Again, the Dungeons and Dragons fan wiki, which seems to be focused more on Greyhawk, but that is dungeons.fandom.com. And before I go, again, as a final note, earlier I mentioned that there was a weird thought that came to me in regards to the Blood War, and that is this. Now, one thing I didn't talk about was the fact that demons can corrupt any plane that they visit, and they do it just by going there in enough numbers and staying for a long enough time. Now, one of the things that's mentioned is that, it's hard to keep demons controlled enough to make that happen. But all a demon group would have to do would be to create, to create something that's semi-permanent, and their presence would eventually corrupt an entire plane to turn it into a place where the demons would feel at home and be easy for the demons to invade and enslave and add to their power. Now, if you're familiar with Spelljammer, you know that the material plane is actually made up of a variety of crystal spheres which hold the sub-universes like realm space that I was talking about before. And between these crystal spheres is a sort of transcendental cosmic flame called Phlegathon. Now, was Phlegathon, or were Phlegathon and the crystal spheres created in order that the demons could not conquer the whole of the material plane too easily? That is to say, by separating the material plane into these chunks, was that a way to ensure that the demons could only ever conquer one chunk at a time? It made me think, because, obviously the easiest way for a demon to get off of the lower planes is to be summoned, and most people who would think of summoning a demon would be mortals who were tricked into it. So without the crystal spheres and the Phlegathon, would it be possible for the demons to have simply taken over the material plane and then been able to assault the rest of the other planes? That's just, food for thought, especially if you like all of this deep lore stuff that I clearly do. I was thinking this video would be 30 minutes, and it turned out to be an hour and 30 minutes. And again, I might cut this up, but or I might even redo this. But for right now, that is the intro to the history of the Blood War. My name is Jay Onwuka, and I hope you hit like and join me next time.